Wyoming invented a limited liability company in 1977, and so it has this interesting long history of allowing individuals to do business through LLCs. There's no state income tax. There's nothing that the IRS can get out of the state of Wyoming. So it's a really friendly state from the crypto industry's perspective anyway.
Here's to Wyoming becoming the model for everywhere. I'm here with Caitlin Long, who's the co-founder of the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition and has spearheaded some of the most impressive legislation that has been adopted regarding blockchain technology. So thank you so much for chatting with me.
Oh, Naomi, it's a pleasure. It's such an honor to be with a fellow redhead Bitcoiner. Yes.
We got to stick together, absolutely. So walk me through what's actually happened in Wyoming. It's sort of thrown around as this wonderful example of what legislation should be regarding blockchain in America. And you were really at the forefront of making that happen. So walk me through it.
Sure. Well, we passed 5 bills last year, and we have 7 more coming. In fact, actually, they're in the committee hearing today. 2 of them just passed the committee hearing.
Yes,
so first,
we've got to celebrate.
Yes, indeed. And the one that's most interesting today that passed the committee is the amendment to the big one from last year, which has some technical corrections in it, not unusual. But most importantly, it actually defines utility tokens as a class of property, a new class of digital property in Wyoming. That is significant for lawyers because property law is governed by state law. And so if you are property, not a security, then technically the state law should govern. Now, the feds obviously take the opposite view, and we heard from SEC Chairman Clayton here. He thinks, of course, most of these tokens are securities.
Well, he actually stated, we don't really know, people who are starting up these companies, these ICOs, if you don't know whether it's a security, presume it's a security. That sort of presumption that everything is in the SEC's jurisdiction is something that I really take issue with, because it doesn't just apply within America. I mean, the SEC's arm is super long, and it reaches outside of America to countries all over the world.
Yes, absolutely, and I do too, and that we did in Wyoming. And you asked what was special about it early on. We're keeping with the ethos of the industry. It's a decentralized industry. We're just trying to green light the businesses to come into the state of Wyoming. One of the other bills that we passed last year exempts all cryptocurrencies from taxes. So that we've done some interesting things that are designed to just enable the industry to be itself, as opposed to try to form the industry, meld the industry into what we, government mandarins view it should be, as so many other regulators in other states and of course at the federal level are doing.
Absolutely. And that issue of taxation, I think, is so important. You look at the market at the moment, and I feel like so many people are just holding onto their currency. I've heard people around this conference today say, oh, I used to trade, but I don't anymore because every trade I make is a taxable event. And it makes it really hard for cryptocurrency to become successful if the government is just clamping down on every action you do, and it's not financially viable for people to be trading and moving this money around if everything's taxable. I'm not going to buy a coffee with Bitcoin if I know that it's a taxable event.
I think that's so true, and personally, I can't even tell you the number of hours I spent on my own taxes. I think we all have similar stories. But at the federal level, that is the priority: is getting some clarification on the taxes and some exemption for small value transactions. That's one of the benefits of the big industries the big companies like Bakkt coming into this sector, is it actually does provide some regulatory protection, and they can bring their lobbyists to bear to try to get clarification. So I don't mean to single out Bakkt per se. Obviously there are Fidelities coming in, Citigroup's coming in, and a lot of names like that. But because they start caring about this industry, they will actually start helping from the regulatory perspective. And when Bakkt talked today about all the work it's doing with Starbucks, that is about small payments. And obviously, if every Starbucks customer who pays with Bitcoin has to pay taxes on it, that's not good for Bakkt's business. So that's one of the things I think that can help from a regulatory perspective, is that big companies are starting to care about this. I think there are other drawbacks to those big Wall Street firms coming into Bitcoin.
And also you got to wonder about regulatory capture. Do big companies coming in, creating the laws around this, is that going to preclude a lot of the smaller companies from coming in and competing? They're always, that very anti-competitive mindset, but it does seem that there are some good points as well to them, sort of taking charge and making sure that the regulation is good for the crypto industry.
Yeah, like everything in life, it's never black and white. There are pros and cons, but yes, I think that's true. I think Andreas talks about Corpo Coin, that what's going to happen is if Bitcoin gets too corporatized, that the industry will split off and Bitcoin will go in its own direction, and Corpo Coin, which would be the corporate version of Bitcoin, will stay regulated and inside these big firms. I actually think there's a pretty good chance that is how this plays out, because the regulation is going to stifle a lot of the innovation, and we Bitcoiners who've been around before the regulation even got started, before the regulators even knew about Bitcoin, are going to bristle under that. And I think it's also true that most of the Bitcoin developers are not going to go work for big traditional Wall Street firms.
Right. Let's go back to Wyoming and talk about the regulation that's been crafted there. Is it true that, when you look at SEC regulation, they regulate the consumer. So it's not really about, where the company's incorporated, it's about where the consumers are based. So does the Wyoming regulation mean that it's just the people who use cryptocurrency in Wyoming that they, get a better deal there?
That's a great question. Technically, yes, but there is an interesting angle, which is that Wyoming invented the limited liability company in 1977. And so it has this interesting long history of allowing individuals to do business through LLCs. And so the lawyers tell me that it's an aggressive stance to say, everybody go get a Wyoming LLC and put your cryptocurrency in an LLC. I'm not giving legal advice here, but you get a nexus to Wyoming if you do that. I will not give any advice as to legal or tax.
No advice given right here.
But you can see how that's interesting. I actually got a phone call from a luminary in the industry recently asking me, why couldn't we just set up 1 million LLCs for every single individual retail customer and have them all do the business in Wyoming? And I gave him the same answer I gave to you. Lawyers have thought of that and said that's probably aggressive, but it hasn't been tested yet. And individuals can always go and set up a Wyoming LLC, which and the Bitcoin industry, Bitcoin community rather, would find that interesting in Wyoming, aside from the tax benefits, for another reason, which is that Wyoming does not collect the information about the members of an LLC other than who forms it. So that's one of it. There are a couple of interesting aspects. One is if the FBI comes calling, they have one name and one address, but not everybody who's involved, and to share with the government. So in other words, they can't really get much from a privacy perspective. And the other is because there's no state income tax, there's nothing that the IRS can get out of the state of Wyoming. So it's a really friendly state from the crypto industry's perspective anyway.
It's sort of mind-boggling when you look at the state of the United States in general, with this overreaching government and this surveillance state where they're just looking into everything, and then talks in Australia and New Zealand about ending end-to-end encryption. No longer will our devices be secure because they're putting backdoors in everything. And then suddenly we have this state in the middle of America that's saying, we're not going to collect your information, we're not going to tax you in this state, and you can start a company here and use cryptocurrency freely, and you're going to be much better off than anywhere else. That's really surprising and refreshing.
Well, it's not new to Wyoming, though. It's a state that historically has taken on the feds on a number of issues. I think it was the second to the last state to raise the drinking age to 21, and it was a federalism issue. It likes the feds to leave them alone, and so we knew back when the utility token bill was passed that it was likely to be controversial in Washington, D.C., and because it was taking a different stand than federal securities regulation, but that's not something Wyoming has ever shied away from. The ethos of Wyoming, as you and I were talking earlier, comparing New Hampshire to Wyoming, these are the two pretty libertarian-esque states. The ethos of Wyoming fits pretty well with this community.
So why wasn't the Free State Project put in Wyoming? It seems like they have such an amazing infrastructure already and a precedent of being very freedom oriented.
Yes, actually, great question. And actually, I asked Jason Sorens the same question because I've been involved with the Free State Project in New Hampshire as well, and I'm kind of torn between the two states. I love both of them. And the answer is, back when he put it out to vote at the beginning of the Free State Project, Wyoming came in second. And it was one particular issue, which is very true, and I give the community, the libertarian community, a lot of credit for sniffing this out, which is that there's a strong mayor structure in the towns in Wyoming, whereas in New Hampshire, you literally go to the town gym and participate in the town council meetings, and you have a vote. Whereas in the Wyoming towns, you actually have the ability to capture the local government because it's got a strong mayor structure. That was Jason's issue that he pointed out in his, I think it was a PhD thesis. And sure enough, the community said, you know what, the local control actually matters, and voted New Hampshire in instead of Wyoming.
That's fascinating. Well, the next question would be, are you going to sort of bolster Wyoming and do as much as you can and keep focused on there, or are you looking to replicate this across other states such as New Hampshire?
Well, it's great. I get a lot of that question, a lot from other states of reaching out to me, and I'm interested in helping. Certainly in New Hampshire, philosophically inclined. I actually think there's a decent chance.
We need you.
Done. Yeah, but I'm partisan to Wyoming too. At the end of the day, I'm balancing both the desire to help the Bitcoin community grow as well, and keep regulations friendly and enabling rather than restrictive. But I'm pretty partisan to Wyoming. I've definitely helped in New Hampshire already as well.
You've been a huge help in so many ways. Just to wrap up here, I want to just look at the difference between New York City, which previously has been called the financial capital of the world, and Wyoming, which previously has had no such title whatsoever. You presume that New York is going to be very forward-looking. You presume that if they're the financial capital, you have people there who understand that there are new technologies being invented all the time. They want to stay abreast of all of that. You know, I would have thought that blockchain coming in would have been a great thing. You saw lots of startups there. You had this Silicon Alley, they called it, and then this BitLicense came in, everyone left, Kraken closed its doors, Shapeshift closed its doors, and it's just dead. The blockchain industry is dead in New York City. I mean, is there any hope, or is there a way to petition the government, get things repealed, to have something similar to what's going on in Wyoming?
Well, good question. I don't think New York's going to go back on the BitLicense. And in fact, actually, historically, New York has had this attitude towards financial regulation. They have a strategy of being the most regulated state, and New York has thought that has paid off. And in the regulated financial industry, that may be true. But I'm an insurance person by background. What's interesting is, you know how the insurance industry dealt with it? Insurance is a state-regulated industry. Insurance companies have one entity that has 49 states and another separate entity under an umbrella parent company that's New York. So New York has extraterritorial jurisdiction. It's a very similar strategy. They've taken a heavy-handed approach in insurance, and everybody just goes around them and says, okay, well, I'm only doing my New York business in one entity, and for everything else, I'm avoiding New York deliberately. There are ways around. People get creative when it comes time to dealing with oppressive regulation. I do think that there are a number of startups, especially in Brooklyn, that have stayed in New York City because there is a lot of talent here, but they're not necessarily domiciled here for tax purposes. They just happen to have employees here in New York for tax purposes. And I'll close with a comment from Joe Lubin. He came out to Wyo Hackathon. We did a hackathon out at the University of Wyoming as a thank you to the state, and a number of big luminaries from the industry came in to thank Wyoming and take a look around. And Joe said, look, there's no reason the next Google can't be invented in Wyoming. It's not likely to be invented in a heavy-handed regulatory state. Those were not his direct words, but that was the implication. And this is such a global decentralized industry. The developers are all over the world. There was a team that added up, they had traveled 60,000 miles collectively between them because they were literally located all over the world to come to Wyo Hackathon. There are not very many industries that are this global, seriously. And so you really can't predict that there's going to be a Silicon Valley because they're literally going to be located all over the world, but they will go to the places that treat them the friendliest. And there's no question Wyoming is the friendliest within the United States.
Absolutely. And just looking forward into the future, so Bitcoin came around as this way of decentralizing trust, decentralizing currency, and I think that decentralizing things really does make it a lot harder to control, and we've seen that. And I just look to exactly, and I look to the future and just wonder whether the government gets so heavy-handed that everything just becomes decentralized. When you look at how the SEC has dealt with a lot of ICOs, one of the things that they look at is how decentralized is it? How well could it run without this single entity, controlling things, keeping things moving? So is that what's going to happen? We just see that middle company focal point be knocked out entirely, and suddenly we'll just have things that go around the government rather than trying to, create good jurisdictions legally. Maybe we just have better tech that circumvents it entirely.
That is indeed what seems to be happening. And actually, the stablecoin example is a perfect example of that. The banks have been working on their own stablecoin called Utility Settlement Coin. It's a UBS project that started in 2015. It's 3 years into it, and what have they to show for it? They're stuck in all the regulatory cruft. And here come stablecoins, which were invented ironically because the banking industry shunned the cryptocurrency industry and wouldn't bank them, so people needed to create a dollar proxy. And so one company Tether came up with this idea, and it was precisely because they gave the cryptocurrency traders a way to pull away from crypto price risk, and nobody had the ability to off-ramp back into fiat. If the banking system had been providing that, stablecoins never would have been created. And yet, here now, what is the big topic? One of the big topics today.
Stablecoins in banks.
In banks, it's so true. And it just came around, it just did an end run around them, and just literally left the incumbents in the dust. We're going to see so many examples of that in this industry, as it is so fundamentally better than the existing system, and the existing system is stuck with all this tech debt and regulatory debt. It's going to be hard for it to do better in the short term. That's not to say we're not going to have these detours where we have these hybrid products. This industry that attended the conference today clearly has old regulation that they need to deal with. They're not comfortable with self-custodying these assets yet, but I think they will be sooner than we realize.
Not comfortable with individual responsibility and accountability for the individual. Always that safety net, right? The government will protect us with their laws. The government will protect us if things fail. Well, thank you so much for all of the work you've done with regulation in Wyoming. I really do hope to see it replicated all over America, but you've just been such a shining beacon of what's possible in the crypto industry in terms of regulation. So huge thank you to all of the amazing work you've done.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure. It's been a passion project. I'm purely volunteer. It just goes to show you don't need lobbying money to get this done. And citizen legislature in Wyoming, they all have real jobs to go back to. Guess what? When that's the case, they can't be captured as easily as the rest of the legislatures that are professional legislators. It's a really special mix of criteria or characteristics that we have in Wyoming that enabled this. So I hope it can be replicated in other states for the sake of the blockchain sector, but in Wyoming, we've got a good lead.
Sure do. Here's to Wyoming becoming the model for everywhere. Thanks so much. If you like my channel, please hit the like button and be sure to subscribe. I also have a Patreon account and wanted to give a special shout out to all the awesome people there. And a huge thank you to the sponsors of the show for making these videos possible. Thanks so much for watching.
She used to just party, go all the way.